Welcome in. You wanted a deep dive on Hong Kong's history, and trust me, we're about to uncover some serious surprises. Forget the modern skyline for a minute, because this story starts way before skyscrapers. Think fishing villages, ancient empires, even hints of the Stone Age. Ready to go back in time.
Absolutely. And you're right to mention those ancient roots. They're not just interesting trivia. They actually help explain why modern Hong Kong is the way it is. We'll be using excerpts from Wikipedia's History of Hong Kong article today, by the way. A real treasure trove of information.
A treasure trove is right. I always pictured Hong Kong as destined for global status, but it had such humble beginnings. What were things like, say, 7,000 years ago?
Imagine this. The Che people settling along the coast, figuring out how to thrive in this unique landscape. They weren't just passing through their settlements, became the foundation for centuries of continuous development. So in a way, their ingenuity echoes all the way to today's Hong Kong.
That's fascinating. It's like those early choices are still whispering to us across the millennia. But it couldn't have been easy, right? Weren't there other groups vying for control?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Take the Warring States period, a time of intense conflict in ancient China. We see the Yuet people migrating south, likely seeking refuge and stability. Sound familiar? This pattern of migration of seeking haven in Hong Kong, it becomes a recurring theme throughout its history, right up to the 20th century.
Wow, so that feeling of Hong Kong as a safe harbor, a place of refuge, those roots go that far back. That's wild. But were these migrations always peaceful? How did the Che and Yuet peoples get along?
Well, imagine two groups with different customs, languages, and ways of life suddenly sharing the same space. There was definitely competition, but also assimilation. What's amazing is how this blend of cultures during the Warring States period actually made the region stronger, more resistant to outside pressures. It's like a microcosm of Hong Kong's ability to adapt and thrive amidst change.
That's a great point. It's not just a straight line of one group after another. It's the mixing that makes it unique. Speaking of unique, I have to ask about the pearl diving. Did they really find those shimmering treasures right off the coast?
It wasn't a myth. For over 1,000 years, Tai Po Hoi, which literally means the Sea of Tai Po, was a major pearl hunting center. Can you picture that? This area, now known for its bustling city, was once a source of these precious gems traded throughout China.
Okay, that image is seriously blowing my mind. Pearls fishing.
Yeah.
But what about farming? Was early Hong Kong a big agricultural hub?
Not quite. The terrain was a bit too hilly for large-scale farming. That's where salt production comes in. The early inhabitants got incredibly good at extracting salt, a vital resource in those times, and it became a cornerstone of their economy.
Salt, the original Hong Kong hustle, it makes you appreciate those little packets on the table, doesn't it? They were also dealing with bandits and rival clans, right? That couldn't have been easy.
It wasn't a walk in the park, that's for sure. Imagine fortified villages strategically placed to guard against surprise attacks. It was a world where security was a DIY project. But it also speaks to the resilience and resourcefulness qualities that would define Hong Kong for centuries to come.
Talk about a strong foundation. But I'm curious, at what point does this independent, resourceful community start to become the Hong Kong we know today, the one on the verge of global trade?
Well, the seeds of that transformation were sown during the Qing Dynasty. By the 10th century, Hong Kong experienced its first major population boom.
A population boom. What was driving that sudden increase? Were people catching wind of those pearl-laden waters?
This boom was all about survival, not riches. A wave of Chinese refugees, primarily, Song Dynasty loyalists, flooded the region after the Mongols conquered their homeland. Remember that theme of seeking haven? It's playing out again, shaping the very DNA of the city.
Right, so not just seeking opportunity, but fleeing hardship.
Yeah.
It adds this whole other layer to the story, doesn't it? But did this wave of refugees change the social fabric of Hong Kong?
It fundamentally reshaped the city. And here's where we see the Hakka people entering the picture. See, fast forward to the 17th century, and you have another conquest, this time by the Manchus. Their Great Clearance policy forced the Hakka people originally from inland China towards coastal areas like Hong Kong.
Okay, so two major migrations, centuries apart, but both driven by a need for refuge. It's fascinating to see how these historical echoes ripple through time, but we're still in the 1600s here. What was the political climate like? Was it still business as usual under mainland Chinese rule?
Not exactly. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, Hong Kong became more than just a quiet outpost. It was a military stronghold, yes, but also a trading port, attracting attention from far beyond China's borders. And that, my friend, is where we start to see the long arm of the British Empire reaching out.
Okay, the plot thickens. The Brits are coming, and something tells me things are about to get a whole lot more complicated. But before we dive into that, let's take a second to appreciate just how far we've come.
From Stone Age settlements to pearl diving havens, from ancient migrations to the stirrings of global trade. It's clear that Hong Kong's story is one of remarkable resilience and adaptation.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder how all these layers of history, all these whispers from the past, shaped the Hong Kong that would eventually emerge on the world stage.
You know, it's ironic. Those ancient salt-producing communities so focused on preserving things had no idea they were on the verge of being preserved themselves, frozen in time by the tidal wave of change about to hit.
And that wave, as we teased before the break, had a Union Jack on it. This is where those small fishing villages transform into a British crown colony, a process that was anything but peaceful.
Right, it's a complex story, one with lasting consequences. You can't talk about British colonialism in Hong Kong without addressing the elephant in the room, the opium trade.
Right, from pearls to a very different kind of trade, a much more addictive one.
Hmm.
What was the situation in the early 1800s? I know the British had developed quite the taste for Chinese goods, but something tells me it wasn't a simple exchange of pleasantries.
You're right on the money. Think tea silk porcelain. China had what the British craved, but the feeling wasn't mutual. The Chinese economy at that time favored silver, something the British weren't exactly swimming in.
Ah, the classic trade imbalance dilemma. Everyone wants what they haven't got, so how did they bridge that gap?
Well, this is where things get ethically murky. The British, recognizing the addictive potential of opium, started exporting massive amounts of it from India to China. It was a calculated move to create a market for their own goods and offset that pesky trade deficit.
Wow, so they basically created a societal problem to solve an economic one. That's bold, to say the least. Did the Chinese just stand by and let this happen?
Not a chance. A Chinese commissioner named Lin Zexu saw right through the British strategy. He witnessed the devastating effects of opium firsthand and took a firm stance against Queen Victoria herself, demanding an end to the trade.
That's a showdown for the history books. Queen Victoria versus Commissioner Lin. Talk about a clash of titans. How did that play out?
It ultimately culminated in the First Opium War, which raged from 1839 to 1842. It wasn't just about trade, though. It was about power control and who got to call the shots in the region.
And spoiler alert, the British had the bigger guns. So when the dust settled, what did that mean for Hong Kong?
Well, they'd already occupied Hong Kong Island in 1841, using it as a strategic base during the war. And with the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, China was forced to formally cede Hong Kong to the British. Just like that, a new era began.
It's crazy how a single treaty can reshape the destiny of millions. But it wasn't just about signing on the dotted line, was it? I imagine life changed drastically for everyday people.
Absolutely. Imagine waves of British institutions, systems of governance, and of course people flooding into this formerly independent region. It was a complete overhaul, and not everyone welcomed the changes.
It must have been incredibly jarring for those who'd known Hong Kong before the British arrived. Was there any pushback from the local population?
There was definitely resistance, and it's important to remember that the population was already incredibly diverse at this point. Remember those Qing Dynasty refugees fleeing the Mongols? Well, add to them those fleeing the Taiping Rebellion in the mid-1800s, and you've got a melting pot of cultures, languages, and loyalties.
Right. It wasn't a monolithic society by any means. So you've got this mix of those who'd lived there for generations, those who'd fled turmoil on the mainland, and now a growing British population. That's a lot of change to manage. Did the British handle it well?
Let's just say they had their work cut out for them. Take the bubonic plague, for example. In 1894, the third pandemic, one of the deadliest in history, ripped through Hong Kong.
Oh, wow. I'd forgotten about that. The plague was a global nightmare.
And it hit Hong Kong particularly hard. The rapid influx of people, coupled with inadequate sanitation and healthcare infrastructure, created the perfect breeding ground for disease.
It's easy to forget how vulnerable even powerful empires were to these invisible threats back then. Did the plague at least force the British to improve public health measures?
It did lead to some improvements, but often with a dark side. For example, the Peak Reservation Ordinance, ostensibly implemented for public health reasons, ended up being a tool for racial segregation.
Wait, racial segregation in Hong Kong. Tell me more about this ordinance.
Well, Victoria Peak, with its cooler climate and stunning views, was the most desirable place to live. This ordinance restricted land ownership and residence on the Peak to Europeans only. A clear case of separate but unequal.
It's a stark reminder that even in the face of a crisis, those in power can find ways to reinforce existing inequalities. So we've got a booming population, uneven development, the specter of disease and racial tensions simmering beneath the surface. What else defined this period of British rule?
Remember that British thirst for tea we talked about? Well, it wasn't just about securing goods. They were playing the long game, aiming to cement their control over the region.
Ah, so it's time to talk about Kowloon and the new territories. That whole leasing arrangement always seemed a bit strange to me.
It was a strategic masterclass, really. In 1860, following the Second Opium War, yes, there was another one, the British strong-armed China into leasing them the Kowloon Peninsula.
Let me guess. They developed a taste for victory after the first one.
You could say that Kowloon, situated directly across from Hong Kong Island, was strategically crucial. It gave them control over both sides of the harbor, further solidifying their dominance.
It's all about that prime real estate. But they didn't stop there, did they? Enter the new territories?
Ever the strategist, the British grew wary of those Chinese-controlled islands flanking their newfound territories. So in 1898, they negotiated a 99-year lease for the new territories, expanding their footprint even further.
Talk about a long-term land grab. But all this talk of treaties and territories, it's easy to forget about the human side of things. What was life like for everyday people during this period? Did everyone benefit from this booming colonial economy?
That's where things get nuanced. Sure, the British brought advancements, hospitals, infrastructure, a Western education system. But these benefits were often enjoyed disproportionately by the European population. For many Chinese residents, life meant discrimination, poverty, and limited opportunities.
It's almost like two separate cities coexisting, each experiencing the same historical events but through vastly different lenses. And let's not forget, while all this was unfolding, another world power was casting a long shadow: Japan.
A shadow that would soon engulf Hong Kong in darkness. The Japanese occupation during World War II is a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the human cost of conflict.
We left off on the precipice of World War II, and as we all know, when a global conflict of that scale erupts, nowhere truly escapes its reach.
And Hong Kong, already caught in the cross-currents of empire and ambition, became a prime target. The Japanese, seeking to consolidate their control over Southeast Asia, saw the British colony as a strategic prize.
A prize that, sadly, they were all too willing to seize by force, December 8th, 1941, a date etched in infamy.
Just hours after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces launched their own surprise assault on Hong Kong. The city, despite its defenses, was ill-prepared for the ferocity of the attack.
It's hard to imagine the fear and uncertainty, that sense of the world turning upside down in a single day. Did the defenders have any chance of repelling the invasion?
They put up a valiant fight. British, Canadian, Indian, and local volunteer forces all fought bravely. But the Japanese had air superiority, and their advance was relentless. Within weeks, key strategic points were under their control.
And by Christmas Day, less than 3 weeks later, British officials were forced to make the agonizing decision to surrender.
Black Christmas, a stark and somber reminder that even in the most festive season, darkness can descend. This marked the beginning of a long and brutal occupation.
3 years and 8 months. The phrase itself feels heavy with hardship. What was daily life like for those living under Japanese rule?
Think economic paralysis, hyperinflation that made even basic necessities unaffordable, and widespread food rationing. The Hong Kong dollar, once a symbol of stability, was replaced with the Japanese military yen, a currency with almost no real value. Imagine the desperation, the scramble just to survive.
It's heartbreaking. And on top of the economic hardship, you have the psychological toll of living under a repressive regime. Was there any room for resistance in that environment?
There was, and it's a testament to the human spirit. Even in the face of immense danger, underground resistance movements emerged, working to sabotage Japanese operations and gather intelligence. But let's be clear, defiance came at a steep price.
A price paid in blood, no doubt. The Japanese military was notoriously brutal.
Sadly, you're right. Torture, imprisonment, execution. These were the risks those resisting took. It was a time of incredible courage, but also unimaginable suffering.
You mentioned earlier that Hong Kong's population had exploded before the war. What became of those residents during the occupation?
Many, facing starvation and unimaginable hardship, were forced to flee. By the time the war ended in 1945, the population had plummeted to less than half its pre-war numbers. A stark reminder of the human cost etched beneath the grand narratives of war.
From a bustling hub to a ghost of its former self, the resilience of the city must have been pushed to its absolute limit. But then in August 1945, liberation finally arrived.
A wave of relief washed over Hong Kong as British and Chinese troops entered the city, marking the end of the occupation. But while the nightmare was over, the scars remained. Rebuilding would be a monumental task.
Rebuilding both physically and psychologically. Where do you even begin to heal after such a traumatic experience?
It's a process, not an event. But amidst the rubble, seeds of transformation were already being sown. 1949 saw the victory of communist forces in mainland China and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. This sent shockwaves across the region and triggered another wave of refugees seeking safety and opportunity.
A familiar echo in Hong Kong's story, isn't it? Each wave of newcomers bringing with them their own experiences and aspirations, adding to the city's complex tapestry.
And this wave, like those before it, would indelibly shape Hong Kong's future. These refugees, many highly skilled and driven, brought a new wave of energy and entrepreneurial spirit. They weren't just fleeing hardship, they were building a future.
So alongside the post-war reconstruction, you have this incredible surge of human capital ready to work to create, to rebuild. Is this the birth of the economic powerhouse we know today?
It's a pivotal moment. Hong Kong transformed from a center of entrepot trade, basically importing and exporting goods, to a manufacturing powerhouse.
Yeah.
Textiles, electronics, all those made in Hong Kong labels we grew up with. That's the legacy of this era.
A phoenix rising from the ashes. But rapid industrialization always has its downsides. Was everyone included in this economic miracle?
Sadly, no. While some prospered, many were left behind. The influx of refugees, while vital to the boom, also led to severe housing shortages. Imagine vast squatter settlements lacking basic amenities sprawling across the cityscape.
Progress and poverty existing side by side. It's a tale as old as time itself, isn't it?
And this tension, this struggle for balance, continues to define Hong Kong's story. The decades leading up to the 1997 handover were a whirlwind of growth, yes, but also of labor unrest, pro-democracy movements gaining momentum, and the constant negotiation between preserving a unique Hong Kong identity and navigating the growing influence of mainland China.
The handover wasn't just about the transfer of political power, it was a cultural crossroads.
Exactly. It was a city grappling with its past, its present, and the uncertainties of the future. On one hand, you had cantopop music and Hong Kong cinema finding a global audience, this vibrant fusion of East and West captivating the world.
Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan icons born from that cultural crucible.
And at the same time, you have this looming question, one country, two systems. Would it be a promise kept or a prelude to assimilation? The answer, as with most things in history, is complex and continues to unfold even today.
So as we reach the end of our deep dive, one thing is clear. Hong Kong's story is anything but simple. It's a tapestry woven from ancient ambitions, colonial struggles, the resilience of refugees, and the enduring spirit of a people determined to forge their own path. It's a reminder that history isn't just a collection of dates and events. It's the sum of countless individual stories, each one adding its own thread to the rich and ever-evolving narrative of a place.
And for Hong Kong, that narrative is far from over. The future remains unwritten. But if its past is any indication, it will be a story of adaptation, resilience, and the enduring pursuit of identity in a world constantly in flux.